I've called you a retired professor, I've called you an editor, and
I've been called worse.
yes. But in here, there are a lot of comments. He's a very respected authority, I would say, on not only William
Very
Cullen Bryant,
authoritarian.
but others. But thank you for coming, and thank you, Charlotte, for doing your wonderful refreshments.
Yes.
That evening would be worthy of any English department tea.
Yes, Kate just mentioned this. This is a terrible book called American Poetry. They charged much too much for it. Each of us was assigned a period to write about American poetry, but none of us knew what anybody else was writing about. Which is an interesting concept for a parlor game, but not for a real book. But anyway, it was supposed to be done, I think, in 2012. I worked and struggled to get it. I said I can't get it done by June 1st, but I promised September. And of course, I didn't get it done till October. And then I waited and waited and waited, and finally the stragglers came in. So the time came for the general editor to say, well, we need some biographical information. And I said, I don't want the school I work for to be identified, because they forced me into premature retirement by this monumental idiocy. And of course, then he went ahead and did this on his own. He said, well, it gives you more authority. I said, well, I don't need that kind of authority. People judge me on what I say. I never liked professional titles. I don't like this nonsense of, PhD and all other nonsense. Especially since having worked within the system, I know what it reflects. I remember I'm sorry I'm taking time away from the lecture, but for a while I was in Sweden on a Fulbright, and at that point they changed the regulations because the regulations were not efficient enough. Swedes are very efficient. They count exactly how many steps and which ways your toes are pointing, and they work out a plan for a kitchen and all that sort of thing. So anyway, they had a commission, worked for 15 years. Of course, they all got paid, came over to the United States to study a more efficient way of studying, of rating people's competence in English, okay? And that way they could cut out one layer or maybe even two of review of the exams. And after all this time, they came up with was a multiple choice examination. Certainly one of the glories of American higher education, right? And the night before the exam, a friend who was also teaching in the same department called me up, and this fellow had come from Oxford and left Oxford because he thought it would be more exciting to teach young women and instead of just all these males at Oxford. So he called me up. This is a fellow who really disliked America at all. I mean, he didn't never think of going to America. It's awful. But he made an exception for me, sort of allowed himself to like me as an American. He said, tell me, Frank, in America, do you say, and he went through a whole list of examples of grammatical instances. And finally I said, we do speak the same language, and there are some minor differences, but what is this nonsense? Why are you calling me up at 10 o'clock? He said, well, I just looked over the examination. And he said, the instruction said that for each and every question, there is one and only one correct answer. And I think there were 120 questions. And he said, well, that does it. For not one question is there one and only one correct answer. For some there were 4, for some none, for some 3, but never one. And I saw that. Well, I thought this was awful. People were going to be certified on the basis of a nonsensical examination. So I saw the head of the student union, and they do have unions there which protect the rights of, and I didn't like this fellow. For one thing, he was a communist, self-professed, and he thought that everything that was written before 1900 should not be part of the curriculum, which I thought was terrible. So I didn't like this fellow, but in a matter of conscience. So finally I met with him and I explained the situation, and he said, well, what's wrong with that? And I said, I'm sorry, I guess I didn't explain this correctly. And I went through it again. He said, yes, I understood it the first time. He said, everybody had the same chance. Well, somehow, instead of now passing 25%, they had to pass 80%. That was because they had to make the whole system more efficient. We've borrowed some of that logic here lately. But anyway, so they had to get to the 80% level of passing the examination. And they reached a certain point where they couldn't make any any discriminations at all. So, but they still had to reach 80%. So the professors, and only they were, at this high level, could make this decision. They just started laughing, and they'd say, "Oh, pick her, she's got a C cup, and I'm not joking, and I was just appalled. And people were certified just on the basis of whim, and someone said, "Oh well, yeah, she took the exam 3 times already, so let's get her out of here." And so, remember this in Kafka. I think it's in the trial, but maybe it's in the castle. When Joseph K. finally gets to the inside of the power structure, he discovers that the authorities are reading dirty books. And one of the things that I've discovered in life is that's really realism. That's exactly the way things work. If they're not dirty books, it's some other foolhardy nonsense. Anyway, to get to what I'm talking about. Sorry. I've been away from the classroom so long, it's so exhilarating, it's hard to stop myself. The invention of the American short story. Well, you might say, well, what are you talking about, the invention of the American short story? Maybe there's something distinctively American about it. Short stories, people have been telling stories forever. And that's quite true. But there's a difference, and not so subtle differences, between narration, simple narration, and the concept of a story, and even more of what the short story is. The word short story is not used to describe this mode of fiction. First recorded use of it is 1874. And it's not used again with any frequency until 1878. That's pretty late in the game. We've always had names for short narration, for short fiction, but the definition has been kind of hazy. It's been all over the place. It's a little like saying, well, people have always run. But the minute you say, well, we're going to set a limit of 100 meters or 1,000 meters or a marathon, that changes the strategy. That changes how you approach the thing. Or the high jump, or any kind of jump. That's, again, a natural activity. And then along comes a fellow named Fosbury and does it differently, and that changes the nature of the sport. Well, it's the same thing, I think, with narration. If you go, we've had narratives for a long time. Even if we look at the beginnings of the American short story, and most people will date it from 1819. We'll get back to that in a moment. E.T.A. Hoffmann publishes fantasy pieces, or Fantasiestucken, in somewhere end of the first decade of the century. So why doesn't that qualify? Well, if you read E.T.A. Hoffmann's stories, and they're really quite interesting, they're very, very different from what emerges as an American short story. So there's got to be a transformation in the understanding of what someone is doing when writing a short story. We go back to back in history, the Nobilieri, the Italian writers of stories, who influenced European culture very, very strongly. This stuff where now people had an education, they could read, and the books were relatively cheap, compared to what they had been when people were doing it all by hand. And stories were very popular, and these things spread throughout Europe. It was a novel experience for people to be able to read stories instead of having stories told to them. Shakespeare used 4 of the stories of someone named Bandello, Matteo Bandello. This is 16th century, but you can go back before that. You can go back all the way to the Bible, really. But stop and think about that for a moment. We all know Bible stories. At least we're all of the age of, some of us read the Bible, or most of us read the Bible, or at least knew those stories. I remember teaching a class once, and I asked if anybody knew who Joseph was. I was teaching Faulkner. And nobody had any idea who Joseph was. Joseph, sleeves, many-colored. Never heard of him. I was also shocked when I learned that nobody in class knew who Luther was. This was at a select school, of course. Anyway, if we go back to I remember talking about the Bible, a friend who was a refugee from Germany who had a favorite German butcher in town. And one day the butcher said to him, "Well, Hans, what is it that you teach?" And Hans said, "I teach the Bible." And he says, Yiddische Geschichte. and that's true. I mean, the Jews are the people of the book. It's one of the unifying elements that they all know these stories. There's a whole part of the religion is dedicated to interpreting stories, finding the moral meanings of it. This is what integrates a people. It's what integrates us as Americans. But of course, back at the beginning of the 18th century, we had no such fund of stories to draw upon. And we didn't know what a story was. Again, we all knew Bible stories, but Bible stories just go on. They're chronicles. We're told that this happened. This man was married to this woman, or married her after discovering that the woman he was really trying to go after was not available to him. He had to take Leah instead. But there's no meaning at the end of that story. It's not as though the narrator, God or whoever, is saying, okay, now we've reached the end. The concept of an ending to the story, right, is really relatively modern. And so is the concept of a beginning. This is what makes a story, and the relationship of the ending to of the story to the ending, as well as to the beginning. I'm going to take a quick sip here. And this is something that people begin to recognize when Irving finally, in 1819, and there's been a lot of stories, a lot of published stuff in American periodicals before that, but nothing quite like what Irving writes. He writes Rip Van Winkle. This is when Irving, who was an accomplished writer before that, he'd written the history of New York. There are lots of fascinating characters, these Dutch caricatures who have exaggerated facets of their personality, but they're not really stories. They're not short stories or tales or whatever you want to call that new genre that's emerging at this point, or in the process of emerging. This is a new thing. Where does it come from? Well, Irving is very much a citizen of the 18th century, even though he only comes to prominence at the beginning of the 19th century. And like everyone with that kind of middle-class education, he had read the Spectator papers. The Spectator papers came into being at the beginning of the 18th century, coinciding with the emergence of a middle class. That's important to remember. Short stories don't tell the story of heroes, doesn't tell a story of people who are more than the average. Part of its appeal is that the people we're writing about in these stories is much like us, and their doings reflect our world. Well, and another aspect of this new concept of literature is not only is it for the middle class, but it's for the city dweller. And the city dweller who's really trying to understand the nature of the city and the nature of this new political climate that's emerging. The Spectator papers and the Tatler before were distributed at coffee houses. Suddenly you have coffee houses, people meet and they talk, and it gives them something to discuss. One of the things they fill the Spectator papers with is descriptions of kinds of people. Going back to Theophrastus, a classical writer who invented the character. And what the Theophrastan character did was to take a certain kind of person and describe what all people who were like this had in common. Well, if you're Joseph Addison or Richard Steele, and you're trying to describe the life of the city, so people will feel a little more familiar, and they say, oh yeah, I know someone who's just like that. They start describing a Puritan. Well, here is the classical Puritan. This evolves into describing the characters in the Theophrastan sense, giving them individual names, and talking about how they relate to society and what their values are. So you have in the Spectator the invention of a club of people with representative types, chief among them being Roger de Coverley. And he is a country gentleman, and he has his quirks, which make for some interest. He has his moral stance, and there's Andrew Freeport, who's a merchant, and as his name will tell you, and he has his quirks. And, and then we have Will Honeycomb, and he's a socialite. So that these people now become our means of exploring society and the people who come to London and this new kind of life. Well, way back when, and I couldn't document this for you, but little things, little facts stick like lint to my mind. I read that the book that was most frequently found in American households back in the 18th century, and indeed going back further than that, almost everybody had a copy of the Bible. Number 2 was Pilgrim's Progress. Now, farther down the list, but nevertheless, number 3 on the list, at least in the 19th century, was the Spectator papers. And this created an American middle-class style of writing and a middle-class kind of consciousness. Those of you who've read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography will remember that he taught himself to write by reading the Spectator papers, translating a Spectator paper into verse, putting it aside, then he would go back to it and then retranslate it back into prose, and then compare that to the original as a way of schooling himself in how to write. It had a powerful influence on people. So anyway, here we have Irving, and he has been dealing with types in his history of New York. He also had, a few years earlier, published something called the Salmagundi Papers with a couple of associates, friends, who were just having a good time. These were middle-class brats who were 17, 19, 24 years old, and they liked to gather, and this was part of their fun. And they were emulating what Richardson Addison and Steele had done in the Spectator papers. So he had done this kind of thing before. Then he reaches an age when he's supposed to do something and, carve out a living for himself. And his family is in business, but the business is doing very poorly, so he goes over to England to try to rescue it. And while he's there, the family business collapses. He goes to see an influential young man up in Scotland, Walter Scott, who at that point is not yet known by his name, and he's known as the Great Unknown. And Scott impresses him by the importance of locality. Now remember, this is the point at which a new paragon, a new form of thinking is taking shape. The previous century we'd seen a codification of values, which we call neoclassical. Educated people look back to the classics for their models. If you praise something as original at the beginning of the 18th century, you were praising it, saying that it was like the first poets, the first writers, that it was, of course, decadent, because that's the nature of history, things get worse and worse and worse, but it was more like the first appearance of things. By the end of the 18th century, the word original has changed its meaning. It is one of the major turning points, crossroads in Western civilization, this transformation in thinking. Interestingly, in American government, we have a reversal of the forms. The Declaration of Independence is really a romantic, or what was later called romantic document. It had romantic ideas about the importance of freedom, liberty, feeling, things came from God. And the Constitution, which came afterward, and this free form expression, which was Jefferson's handiwork, was seen as inadequate to deal with the reality of people's lives. We needed rules, we needed checks and balances. Whereas the Declaration of Independence said that people are fundamentally good and society corrupts them, so we've got to get back to those things that are freely expressed and not confined by rules, get away from rules, dislike government, that kind of thing, to the Constitution, in which we say, no, man is essentially evil. This is a neoclassical idea. We have to educate people so that they're not evil, so they learn to check their impulses, check their emotions. Emotions are dangerous and so forth. Well, anyway, this way of thinking was also very important in terms of how we looked upon art and what was worth writing about and what the function of art was. So that we're slowly seeing it as the 1600s turn into the 1700s is this radical change in conception of the arts. At Harvard, there were food riots, and riots that were more serious than food riots, by students who were protesting the curriculum. They said, we want to be able to read Anne Radcliffe. I don't know if any of you have read Anne Radcliffe. She's a terrible writer, at least in my estimation. This new thing called Gothicism, you know, where the purpose of literature is to excite the emotions. You scare people to death. You cause them to doubt their senses. Oh, you know, how did that person walk through the wall and so forth. And then there was always an explanation at the end. One of the most popular books was popular authors, a fellow known as the Monk. I mean, it was all about entering into forbidden territory, which was a corollary of the darker passages of our minds, you know. So that this monk, who's a character in this book, would get a woman up against the wall and say, I'll have you, alive or dead, you know, wow. You know, people were not allowed to think those things earlier because this is dangerous territory. So that they were looking for a new form of expression at the beginning of the 18th century. And the old ways were cracking. You know, the poet that's been looked upon as the best of modern poets was Alexander Pope. You know, you look at that form, nice, neat couplets, you know, everything's just precise. A master. No one was ever better, and no one since has ever been better than Pope. But it was like a fine watch. And in reaction to Pope, you have people emerging like Wordsworth, you know, who are looking for organic forms, no rhythms, the importance of feeling, you know. The form of literature is a recollection in tranquility of how one felt earlier, that sort of thing. And along with it, though this was not Wordsworth's particular area, that which was scary, the Gothic, that which excites you. Literature should be something which takes you out of the present, out of the comfort zone. Anyway, so here is Irving now, and he's talking to Scott, and he tries to apply these lessons. He's thinking about them. And while he's in Scotland, one night, he gets the idea for Rip Van Winkle and writes it out in one night. And he's going to try to publish a book so that he's going to earn some money. He doesn't know quite what he's going to do in this book. A lot of essays, some few very modest tales. There are 3 of them in the sketchbook. And one of the ones that he focuses on and hopes for success with is Rip Van Winkle. And that's published, and it causes something of a stir. And when the 2 parts of the sketchbook are published together, there's another one called The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And they are incredibly successful. This is a new way of writing. You know? And it's not just the story, it's not just the plot, it's the way it's written. You know, the emphasis is on the circumstances of these characters, the local history, you know, the wit with which the character is drawn. And so what would really make for a very dull story, normally, is transformed. I mean, if you all remember Rip Van Winkle, right? Mm-hmm. Think of that story. That story boils down to there's a lazy husband who has henpecked by his wife. And one day, this ne'er-do-well goes off, and he stumbles onto a group of Dutchmen, and they're bowling, and he doesn't quite have a conversation with them, but they invite him to drink, so he drinks and he sleeps for 20 years. Now, is that an interesting story? Irving admitted that the idea for the story maybe was hatched by, I'm looking frantically for one of my books that I brought, and I don't quite see it, but let's see here somewhere. Yeah, the bottom of my bag. There's a story called Peter Klaus. Now remember, this is also the period in which people start collecting folk tales, because whereas literature before was only supposed to deal with people at the top of society, the rest of us didn't count, now it's become the mode to look at how peasants and people who don't have education, because remember, education is corrupting. We should get to the real core of what it means to be human. And so that we start collecting folk tales. At the same time that Irving is up in Scotland talking to Scott, the Grimm brothers are collecting folk tales, right? This is a new era, a new set of orientations. Well, Peter Klaus begins in the village of Littendorf at the foot of a mountain lived Peter Klaus, the goatherd, who was in the habit of pasturing his flock upon the Kiefheiser, I probably mispronounced that. Towards evening, he generally let them browse upon a nearby green, surrounded with an old ruined wall, where he could take a muster of his flock. One day, he noticed that one of his prettiest goats disappeared, and he follows the goat, and then he sees people bowling, and that's it. He drinks, he sleeps for 20 years, and he comes back. Well, there was a scandal a few years after this great success of Irving. People were ready to denounce him. He plagiarized the story, right? He's not a good writer at all. It's all found in this Peter Klaus, and then there's another one that's similar to it. Now, Irving readily admitted that he had gotten this idea. He told everybody. What made, in Irving's mind, what made it interesting was how he handled this story, which in this version comes out to 3 pages. Whereas Rip Van Winkle is much longer, and what makes it interesting is the development of the interior life of these characters, at least it's suggested, what their relationships are, where they live. Irving had never been to Sleepy Hollow in New York, even though he didn't live very far away. He imagined it, but he treated it as though it was a place that he knew well. And he gives you, if you think of that story, a very minute description of the people and how they live and who these characters are and what the nature of their lives is. And then Rip comes back. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that the short story or this new modern written down tale has to develop is a sense of what an ending is. Rip comes back and he notices that, well, everything has changed, but everything is the same. And there's his daughter, who sort of looks like his wife, who's now dead, so he's liberated. And the sign over the alehouse where he drank, instead of having a picture of George III, with a slight change, it's now George Washington, you know. And he tells us, and we sort of slide away. But if you stop and think about it, what does that story mean? And that's not something that Irving had resolved. Legend of Sleepy Hollow, his second, we can think of it as his second story, does resolve a kind of meaning. Here we have 2 different types of men vying for the favor of a nice plump Dutch girl. And the question is, which one is she going to choose? This thin intellectual, quote unquote, schoolmaster, who's very uninteresting. We always know these people who are intellectuals, certainly males, are very uninteresting. And she prefers, and in fact, fate, destiny, decrees that she should hook up with Brom Bones. Brom Bones is the all-American or all-Dutch boy. You know, he could be quarterback on the football team, and he's going to have a Chevy dealership in town. That's the kind of guy he is. And sure enough, what we do, and there's sort of a political background to this, because remember, the Dutch and the English were virtually at war in these border areas of New York and Vermont. Vermont was a big battleground. There's people in New Hampshire, you know, who were selling out the land. The governor was selling out the land that he had no title to, so he invented titles. That's what the animosity was there. Made a lot of money at it too, and he had enough sense to know that finally, when people are going to be fighting for their land against other people who are not so numerous, that the people who have the most guns win the struggle. So okay, so we have Irving, and we have this new thing. This new thing comes on between 1819 and 1820. Suddenly, there's a proliferation of stories. Let's just call them stories, because some of them are not stories in the later definition of that term. And some are just adaptations of things that people have found. But there's a great thirst for this. What's happened is that the American magazine has come on the scene. Now, well, you just talked about a Spectator. Yeah, that's a periodical, but we have a lot of different forms of periodicals. The magazine, as we know it, or as that term tries to suggest, is a different kind of fish. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's like a shelf or a room where you throw things. In other words, a magazine. The original use of the word magazine was a storehouse. It was a place where you stored things, especially ammunition or related objects. We didn't know what to call this before. There were different terms that we used. Museum was a favorite one. Miscellany was another. Gallery was another. But there was something, and it was published regularly, and usually didn't last very long. And it had all kinds of information about phases of the moon, when the best time to plant your crops are, this interesting thing that happened in the town not too far away, the effects of a windstorm and who was killed, and all these things were put along with some political items, just accounts of what is happening around in the world. They're put in a magazine. What they were competing against, or what we see on the other side of the Atlantic, is the development of a review. And the review was directed towards the intellectual life of the community. The review reviewed books. That was why it was called a review. Most of these books were political, but there were also histories and so forth. Very highbrow. And so we have this collision between lowbrow or no-brow and highbrow. And they start sort of rubbing up against each other. And something that's intermediate that starts developing in America. And the success of that intermediary form also goes back and influences what's happening on the continent and in Britain. So not long ago, I was reading an article in Prospect, which is an English magazine, British magazine, and someone makes the claim that the short story was invented by Walter Scott. And he goes on to talk about it. And hadn't even bothered to look up the fact that this was 5 years after Irving publishes Rip Van Winkle. Now, I'm not saying that Scott wasn't influenced by Irving, who in turn had been influenced by Scott. But clearly some concept of a story that was separate. And it was Rip Van Winkle, and with it, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, that caused that transformation. Irving goes on to publish several collections after the success of the sketchbook, and I should impose here one other thing. It wasn't just the short story as we know it, or the tale, as it was probably most often called back then, that accounted for the success of the sketchbook. It was also his paying attention to customs. We celebrate Christmas in some large measure because of the way in which Irving described the celebration of Christmas, and which he got from old accounts in England. And oddly enough, the English began celebrating Christmas in that same way. Santa Claus is, you could almost say, is an invention of Washington Irving. Oh yes, there was St. Nicholas and so forth, but particularly this fellow who came along through the sky and all that, and then this was picked up by Clement Clark Moore, who was also part of the circle of people in New York. A lot of New Englanders believe that American literature came out of a crucible in Boston and in Cambridge, maybe a little bit of Concord. Dartmouth just had a MOOC. Do you know what MOOCs are? Mass online, open online course. Yeah. And the guy who taught the course, read F.O. Matheson's book published in 1940 and then paid no attention to anything else, as though somehow American literature was the invention of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Give the news for us, this is not true. Not true at all. But what is happening in America is that around the early years of the 19th century, and going back to the last years of the 18th, America is trying to develop its own literature. And it's having a hard time convincing its own citizens that that's something that should be done. Well, how can we, our language is English. It's the language of Milton and Shakespeare. How can you expect some rubes out here on the other side of the Atlantic, not all well educated? We have no rudder, no foundation, and the great classics of English literature. How can we dare? What are we going to write about? Woods, trees, Well, slowly, there's a sufficiently large group of people dedicated to the idea of the importance of a distinctively American literature. That we're not a people, we are not a nation. Remember, nation means a tribe, it means people related through kinship. That we are not a nation unless we have some common body of literature. It's like going back to the Hebrews, the Jews, the people of the book. Well, we've got to write our own book. And Irving was not completely convinced of that. But William Cullen Bryant is. But we'll get to that in a moment. Am I going over? No. Okay. This nativist strain is very strong in saying if we have to identify our literature with the American landscape, it's not just a question of sticking in some American birds that makes it American literature. No, this is the argument. What we have to do is find the American spirit. What we have to do, and this is something Bryant specifically writes about, but Irving had this sense too, we've got to associate our stories with places. We've got to combine stories with landscape. We've got to celebrate who we are as a people and not worry about being dumb cousins of the learned English who look down their nose at us and still do. But then the question is, what makes us Americans? And that's something that our writers search for. And the means in fiction by which this search is conducted is this protean form that later acquires the name short story. Before we leave, I might just say that, that the period of his interest in this short narrative form is relatively short. He writes his last collection of American stories in 1825. He writes his last collection of any kind of stories, because at this point he's in Spain, and he's going to do a biography of Christopher Columbus. And that's where our misconception that somehow everybody thought the Earth was flat until Columbus came along and said, "Oh no, it's really round." That's not true. But that myth, that misconception, comes out of Irving and his biography of Columbus. Anyway, he's in Spain and has gotten a government appointment, and he's really away from his native land. His attention is elsewhere. 1825. That is when Bryant starts writing short stories. Now remember, it's not as though somebody sits back and says, "Now what's going on? Nobody really knows what's going on. It's as though the market and conditions are creating and inventing a form or making it possible. It's like combining, atoms of this and atoms of that somewhere, putting them into proximity, and then something emerges from that which is new. Or there's a lightning strike, and suddenly we have life, or something of that sort. So it's not as though Irving, especially Irving, really had an idea of where he's going. In fact, it's really a falling off in the quality of his short stories. And towards the end of this period in which he's writing collections of tales, what's happening is that the tale is getting longer. It's more and more like kind of a short novel. And the idea of one event, of that interesting combination, which is not dependent upon simple sequence of this, then this, then this, then this, then this, and now it's time to go to bed. It's not that. That there is an integrity, that there is a field of energy that defines this story. So Irving goes away from that. But everybody now is interested in publishing fiction in these magazines. A lot of people are starting up magazines. They don't last very long, by and large, but that's where the interest is going. So here we have a poet who is in Massachusetts, in Great Barrington. He had wanted to just be a poet, not do anything else, but then he realizes that that's not going to work because you're not going to make a living as a poet. And his father's health deteriorates. The father says, you know, I'm not going to be around forever, so it's time for you to start thinking about earning a living. And son, you're good with language. What should you do? Be a lawyer. The son said, well, I guess I have to, I'll do it. He becomes a lawyer, and he hates it. And he finds it the most boring and stupid thing that he can do, and the judges are ignorant and making bizarre decisions. And Bryant was one hell of a bright guy. I mean, he knew several languages and then learned several more. He was probably our most intelligent writer of all. At least that's arguable. So at a certain point, I can't stand this anymore. Well, what am I going to do? He has a friend, for heaven's sakes, help me, Catherine.
Sedgwick.
Sedgwick, of course, the Sedgwick family, senior moment. And she says, why don't you come down in New York? I'm visiting with my brother, and he goes down and he says, wow, this is a lot better than Great Barrington. And New York is at that point the hub of this nascent American consciousness in literature movement. And people are actually making a living by writing poetry and putting things on stage. And you know, it's much more vibrant than this backwater up there on the Charles. The Hudson is where it's at. And Bryant chooses to become a New Yorker, and eventually becomes one of the most important of New Yorkers, being responsible for, at least in large measure, for Central Park, uniformed police force, the establishment of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and lots of things. But at this point, he is trying to support his family somehow through his pen in a way that doesn't mean dealing with the law. And Catherine Sedgwick's brother says, well, you know, here are these possibilities. Catherine says, I'm sure that to Bryant, she says, I'm sure that if you come to New York, that somehow something will open up. And sure enough, he moves to New York, and the opportunity to edit a periodical called the New York Review opens up. And so he's looking forward to that. One of the things he discovers is that nobody is sending him fiction. So what is he going to do? He's going to write his own. And he does. And he starts off, and now I would say that of all these, and there may be 15 or so writers who are producing short fiction, and a lot of them really don't know what they're doing. And I would say Catherine Sedgwick, for all I admire her work, is one of them. And she's a prolific short story writer, or whatever we call it, tales. But she doesn't know quite how to handle the form. Bryant doesn't either, but he's a scholar, he's a thinker, and I would say that he is the most innovative of all these writers of the 1820s. His first real story is called Pennsylvania Legend. And it is really autobiographical. At this point, he's not been to Pennsylvania. So that doesn't really stop. It's in the form of a fairy tale. And once you know something about Bryant himself, you realize how very, very autobiographical it is. Bryant had a big head, so much so that they tried to shrink it by pouring cold water over it when he was a kid. I mean, you had to have a big head to accommodate that large brain, I guess. While the figure in the story has a hunchback. And there's great, just as people, Bryant's father was rather haughty about the fact that he was so intelligent. Bryant felt somewhat sheepish about that. It becomes the hunchback. This family thinks it's better than everybody else because their humpback is higher than anybody else's. Well, so we get this story about a young man who's isolated from the rest of society. He meets a young woman. He goes after. She just laughs at him. One day he goes down by the stream, and it happens to coincide with where Bryant grew up. There's also the fact the family moves to the yellow house on the hill. It's amazing. I mean, he had to be conscious of this. And this tree starts to speak to him. And she's also a very sensuous tree. So there's, the sexual overtones, you can't miss them. And she gives him 3 wishes in form of a fairy tale. And he abuses them, and he's corrupted morally. And finally, he wants more money, and what he does is he digs, because she keeps saying, if you look under, sort of my right knee, you'll find something, So it's like going on a date, isn't it? And so he digs under her root, and he finds a treasure, and then he wastes that, and then the next thing he does, when he's broke again, he goes back to the tree, and she says, look under my left knee, or whatever. Eventually, of course, he's dissolute. He's lost everything. And so what he does, and his fury is, he keeps digging around the tree and exposes all the roots. And because of that, the tree dies. And he's eventually returned back to his ugly old form, and he's isolated from the rest of mankind. There's a lot of personal transformation there that goes on. Anyway, the next story he writes is he takes as a model the legend of Sleepy Hollow. But in a way, he does it in a much more sophisticated way. I didn't realize this at first when I looked at it, but when I saw how he put it out, how he plotted it not in terms of a series of actions, but rather in terms of the presentation of the elements of the story. And how, even though you're looking at plot, this happens and this happens and this happens, that there's also an underlayer of meaning there, of the relationship between land and the secrets that are hidden there, and the complexities of human beings. Anyway, Bryant wrote 13 stories. And in that, not all of them are great. I'd say 3 are pretty bad. But he also has at least 3 that are really quite remarkable. One of them is, I think, clearly one of the best short stories written in America before Melville comes along and produces that fantastic tale of Bartleby the Scrivener. And yet, all this is not recognized. I'm the first guy who has written about these stories giving them any credit at all. There's occasional mention. Sometimes the titles are misspelled. Sometimes they're not described, but only in a sentence or 2. You get a whole biography of Bryant, and there'll be one sentence in which you're told that he wrote some short stories. All this was forgotten. After the publication of the magazines, the New York Review, and then became the United States Gazette, he latches on to the gift book, which is another new way of presenting stories. I mean, if you just write a story, how are you going to sell it? But if you can find some way of combining it with other material, then it becomes saleable and valuable. So he starts with the gift book, and he has the second most successful gift book of that decade. And this was an enormously popular fad. So he is, during the time he's writing these things, he is much admired. But people do not recognize the importance of the emergence of this new form of literature. And so very soon, before people are paying attention to short stories or tales as significant works of literature, he's already forgotten, and no one has gone back to see. Are you familiar with the term naturalism? The application of scientific experimental techniques to the writing of fiction. Zola writes a book about it, the experimental novel, in which he says, because everybody wants to be a scientist now, He says, we are just like the scientist. The scientist takes a piece of the world, he brings it into the laboratory, and he subjects it to certain pressures and tests, and then he writes up his lab report. Well, we writers are the same. What we do, of course, we can't bring human beings into our studies, because they would cause some consternation, but we take them in our minds, we bring them into our studies, we put them in combination, and the role of the writer is to stand back and record how these characters interrelate. Nobody really writes that way. I mean, the law writes it, but that was the ideal and the idea. 50 years earlier, Bryant is doing the same thing in Three Tales, in one of which has three people who get caught. Three people, 1, 2, 3, yeah. They get trapped in a cave. And when a boulder seals the entrance of the cave, how are they going to survive? How do they react to each other? How do they think about their deaths and so forth? And then finally, there's an intercession and the boulder rolls away through another disturbance caused by nature. But what has made the story has been this kind of lab report on how the young girl reacts and how her swain reacts and how there are 4 people, 5 people, how the priest reacts as an older man. It is a study of human behavior. And that's not the only story in which he applies this naturalist principle. There's another story called The Story of Cuba, in which what you have is a tale in which an American goes down to Cuba and he talks to somebody else who then tells him a story about these Indians who had come down from Florida into Cuba and had done terrible things. And we are put in the position of the white people who are looking at it and saying how horrible it is. It's not until the end of the story that we realize that because we are reading this as white people, that we've identified with the people who are telling the story, who are really the ones who have done the harm to the Indians. And they have created this myth of savagery when the people who have really behaved in a beastly manner are the whites. And you don't realize that until the end of the story, if you're paying attention. Now, that notion of the unreliable narrator is new. I've never found anyone who does this before Bryant, and yet it's gone completely unrecognized. So this is a fascinating period, and it's not like like reading something that's published today. I find a great deal of pleasure in going back and trying to understand what is happening in the form of in the process of creating a form, trying to understand what that form is, trying to understand what the possibilities are, and in various ways exploiting them. Okay, I've talked through a lot. Some of it was perhaps irrelevant, but let me open the meeting up to questions. Anybody? Yes.
Going back, you mentioned the development of the short story coinciding with the development of coffee houses, and it's a middle class.
The development of a certain kind of periodical.
Yes,
Yeah.
but also you mentioned it as being coincident with the development of a middle class.
Yes.
Was this a reflection of leisure time that people had?
Yes. You had leisure, because people didn't have to scratch for a living all the time. You had an urban society, which is very important, so people can meet and talk. The number of people who might be interested in talking about writing a book is relatively small. And certainly, if you're out in East Glastonbury, not many people to talk to. But if you're in a city, there are probably maybe 6 or 7 who are very much like that. That's what American literature really does start in New York City. And when Cooper has gatherings of artists and gatherings of writers, and they start talking to each other. And what are you doing? And what am I? What are your hopes and so forth? New York has a literary culture at a time when Boston doesn't. Boston has has some members of the Harvard faculty and a few people who are interested and who are really striving to create an American literature, more credit to them. It doesn't have the vibrancy. Bryant himself, when he's in New York, he's having a tough time making a living with his New York Review, and he gets the bright idea of combining it with a journal that's coming out of Boston, because Boston can't support it. And they thought, well, if we merge them, it'll have double the audience, but it doesn't work. And the reason is that people in Boston are not interested in reading about people from New York. And so it dies. It takes a while. You know, we forget that we have cities scattered all over, and then all these white spaces in between. You know, just the other night I was reading about making New York a state, and at the end of the 18th century, how much of New York was still being contested by Massachusetts, for example. That's quite interesting, and the relationship between upstate and downstate, which still hasn't been resolved. You know, these are old quarrels. Yes, Mark.
It seems to me that when I was studying William Cullen Bryant, that his focus was mercantile. In other words, he that's one reason I think that New York was so very appealing to him. If you think about someone like Ralph Waldo Emerson, he was all about the spiritual life. You know, in other words, that's where he considered the real American zeitgeist was. It was about the city on the hill, you know, creating something that was spiritually better than Europe, and that's where Emerson thought that the advancement of American literature that was American would come from, because it was a more idealistic environment. But when you have somebody like Bryant, when he's digging up that tree, he's overcome with guilt because he has turned his back on poetry, and he's learned to make a living, just like his daddy said, you know. And he's guilty about it, because it seems that there are two ways. There's the spiritual life, and then there's earning a living. And he's always conflicted about it, and he's always, he makes art out of it, that conflict.
Yeah. The last story that Bryant writes is called Medford.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a moral tale. And it's about a man who has to make a decision. And he's confronted with a fellow who really presents a model life, a model of a Christian life, and tries to teach him how to suppress his instinct and attraction to violence, to human contention, to and Bryant himself. It's about Bryant's life, because at this point, and this was written in 1832, Bryant has got to decide: am I going to publish and be an editor of a newspaper? Am I going to get involved in politics? And he's already up knee-deep in politics with Jackson. Or am I going to go back and write poetry? His good friend Richard Henry Dana, the father of the man who wrote 2 years before the Mass, when Bryant decides he's going to go to New York, says, be careful, and don't take that job with the New York Evening Post, because you'll get mixed up with politics, and politics will corrupt you. Mm. And Bryant says, oh no, I won't do that. But I have to earn a living, I have to learn. In 1832, what he says in this story effectively is, he says, God help me, I love this stuff. And so, and the guy who's telling me that I've got to turn my back on these things, think of the higher values of things, and turn the other cheek. Yeah, that's great, but I can't do it. I love to slug the bastards. And in fact, Brian, people don't know Brian. He's a fascinating guy. There's one point at which there's a rival editor, and he hates the bastard, and he says something about him, and Brian wraps a whip in his hat, in his top hat, goes down to Broadway to look at the guy, finds it, goes, whack! And the guy has a cane, and in the cane there's a blade, and a sword. They're fighting whip against sword. Brian, everybody knows about him in town immediately. Oh my, this distinguished man, from Massachusetts doing this with this bastard down here. And Brian is mortified, and he writes a public letter of apology in the Evening Post, his newspaper. He's mortified, but boy, that was in him. And he could be very angry. he was drawn to Jackson. You know, and Jackson was as far from William Cullen Bryant in terms of his interest, in terms of character, as one could be. But he was a man of action. He got things done. God help me, I just thought, would Bryant like Trump? No, Trump is not. That's part of his problem.
Jackson had an intellect.
What's that?
Jackson had an intellect.
Yeah, okay.
Comparatively.
But he was a man of action, he was a
and-
man of
and he had
spirit.
And he had a rudder, and he had principle, and he acted on principle.
Yes, he certainly had principles. yeah.
Absolutely.
But he also had crazy prejudices. I mean, he didn't
Absolutely.
understand the need for a bank, a national mill, and so
Absolutely.
forth.
Right.
But, you know, and the
He was
conflict
consistent about
between Jackson and Quincy Adams
Right.
couldn't have been more dramatic.
Sure.
Sorry, I have to
No,
go.
no,
Great to
thanks
see
for
you, Frank.
coming.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, and of course, now we're having this big quarrel about whether Jackson should stay on the $10 bill, but
Well, just
we don't
Jack-
really know very much about these people generally in our society.
Well, just to stick to Jackson, the political connection, you mentioned the last story, you mentioned about the Indian,
Story,
where it turns out that the unreliable, I think it was the unreliable narrator.
Yes.
And perceptions of who was doing
what to whom?
what to whom what was unreliable. What year that was, and
Yeah.
what relationship to the Indian Act, the Jackson's
Yeah,
Indian Act? Do you
yeah.
happen to know?
And of course, that's an interesting point because Bryant went through this phase of just, he said just Indians are in his brain all the time. And he's very favorably disposed towards the Indian.
Right.
And how do you reconcile that with Jackson? Well, when Bryant was fated by the Phi Beta Kappa Society in Cambridge, and incidentally, Emerson was graduating that year, so he was there in the audience. You know, Bryant lays out this theory of history, as it were, that we go through these long cycles. And he was not alone in his generation. Maybe they took solace in this, that you can't do anything about the Indian. The Indian civilization is on its way down, and there's no way you can keep it going. It just, the force of history is going to drag them under the rug. And Manifest Destiny, the march westward, I mean, Bryant is very much an expansionist. You know, I mean, he understands that the election of the future is going to be decided in the West. And incidentally, Bryant was instrumental, probably the most pivotal figure in the election of Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, I mean, I know this had nothing to do with literature, but in 1860, the certain candidate for the Republican Party was going to be Seward. Okay, Seward is seen as the tool of Thurlow Weed. Thurlow Weed is the man who was responsible for the invention of the word lobbyist. Thurlow Weed is corrupt, or at least he does the business of politics in the way that it's done. And Bryant, who's just as moral as can be, says, oh my God, we're going to have Thurlow Weed dispensing patronage. Washington is just going to be, you know, a constant exchange of jobs for money under the table. So he said, we've got to do something. He calls a meeting with George Putnam, the publishing house, in the Putnam offices in New York, and a guy named Updike, who was an important figure, and a fellow named Briggs, who was supporting Salmon Chase. He said, look, it's like the Stop Trump, you know, movement. We've got to stop Seward. Weed had said to Seward, look, you're the candidate unless you do something stupid, say something stupid, especially about abolition and slavery. So get out of here, go to Europe where you can have no reporters ask you questions. So he's off in Europe, and Bryant says, we got to do something, we got to stop him. And it's there that they lay out the plan to create a candidacy for Lincoln. I don't know how much of it he shared with the other two, but Bryant had met Lincoln when he went out to see his brother in 1832, and he was impressed by the guy. He liked the combination of the common man and his love of language, his telling stories, and his ability to use his stories to illustrate high moral principles to average people. And so he was, And he was the one who, the first part of this was to invite him to New York, and that was the Cooper Union Address, which turned him into a national candidate. Yeah.
I don't know what my question is, but it's just striking me as you're talking about Lincoln in particular and the stories. That is something that Obama and his speechwriters use all the time. This idea of Americans telling their stories, is that what we want to hear as Americans are their stories, anybody's story. And I don't know, is that specifically American, or is what as I say, this is, I shouldn't open my mouth, but I don't know what I'm asking you. Is it just seems interesting to me that this is, 200 years later, and we're still talking about the Americans' stories,
Absolutely.
common man's stories.
That's a very good point. It's a very good observation, because that's true. We from the beginning, the way in which we make ourselves a nation is through stories. We present our candidates through the story, rising from humble beginnings, log cabins and all that stuff. Lincoln was a very, very effective and well-paid railroad lawyer. It had been a long time since he split logs and split rails. But that's the myth, and almost every election is the same thing. We saw the importance of creating a mythology, or maybe we didn't see it, but we certainly understood it, that the nation had, if it's going to be a nation, has to have a mythology about itself. And this is, this surfaces in the closing years and the early closing years of the 18th century and the early years of the 19th century. From the start, American writers feel we've got to create an epic which explains America to Americans. And immediately, the figure whom they hang on to is Christopher Columbus. Now you stop and think about it. Christopher Columbus was a Genoese in not United Italy, who got out. He went to the court of Spain. He was and sailed for a monarchy. I mean, this is an avatar of democracy. It's ridiculous, but that's what he was turned into. And there were no less. I've ran across 5 epics in this early period. If you're going to create an American literature, if you're going to be distinct, you've got to have an epic. And Columbus became the Aeneas. There was this transference, because these men had all gone to school and read the Aeneid. They might cite Greek, but their proficiency was greater in Latin. And in that transformation, that Europe was the old world, the old Troy, as it were. And we were the inevitable next step, and maybe the final step in the story of civilization. And therefore, we had moral imperatives that we had to obey. And the heroes of this mythology have got to embody it. And became Christopher Columbus. Has no relationship to real Christopher Columbus. But it's amazing. It's so someone went around, inoculating everybody with this crazy idea. And oh, for heaven's sakes, my mind is suddenly clouded. Come on. The Columbiad. Who was it who wrote the Columbiad? Oh, this is frustrating. I'll send you all a letter.
Email.
Yeah, it's in my. I don't have my. Oh, come on. Joel Barlow. Oh, thank God. This is happening more and more. Joel Barlow wrote the Columbiad. In fact, he wrote it twice. And with somewhat, first one with the vision of Columbus. And Columbus is in his cell. He's been in prison. He's rotting. And what does he do? What happens? He is comforted by this vision, this dream he has of what America will become. And Barlow was quite prescient. And he says America has not only this order, this model for a new order of mankind. Sign your dollar bills. A new order for the ages. That's what did it become. And what will happen is that free men will latch on to the importance of science. And he forecasts television. He forecasts submarines. I mean, all these wonders will come out the free minds of America. It is our responsibility as Americans to change the order of the world, that Europe will die away, monarchy, inequality. I mean, these ideas are part of our marrow. That's what the new cells come from. We keep hearkening back to that. That's not European at all, you know? If you're the son of immigrants or the daughter of immigrants and you can rise to an important, that's the American story, you know, over and over again. Yeah.
When you talk about an American, the development of an American literature, a desire to develop something that was uniquely American, what comes to my mind is the adventure novel, the lone guy going out to conquer the wilderness with his gun, the sort of a James Fenimore Cooper type. Is there a European...
Who emerges at the same time
Yeah.
that Bryant does, yeah.
Is there a European counterpart to
No,
this?
they borrowed
kind of
ours.
Okay,
No,
so
quite, I mean,
this was
Cooper was
uniquely
enormously
American.
popular in Europe, and that remains in this century. My people come from the northwestern part of Italy. I have met and spoken to 3 people who swore to me that Kit Carson and or Buffalo Bill were Italian. Piedmontese. Oh yeah, my father's, he spoke the Piedmontese dialect with me. I mean, come on. But it's necessary. And my cousins came over here, one of my cousins came over here, and he said, tell me, is the West really like that? Sergio Leone, the man who created spaghetti westerns, right? Never been to America. That idea is, what, Hitler loved American stories, American West. And Germany has its own version of Cooper. And the Germans love that idea. The what is that, Ministry of, not the Exchequer, but of the Treasury, Hjalmar Schatz. His middle name was Greeley. His name was Horace Greeley. Go West, young man. That's why his father named him that. I mean, the myth of America is more powerful even than America itself. And let me join your question. There's a certain point at which American writers stop writing epics about Columbus. And this is about the middle of the second decade, the 1815s. Suddenly Americans discover or rediscover the Indian, the real Indian, not the fabled Indian of the romantic figure of only a decade before. And suddenly we have the epics, those who are trying to still write epics because that's the greatest form of literature, right, are writing about the West and the movement of whites into the West and the conflict between the red man, who was not presented as some Tonto figure, but a savage, but damn it all, finally a man who's fighting for his people and fighting for principles. And we find this in a lost epic. I mean, lost because nobody reads it. I mean, hell, people don't even read Moby Dick. Called The Backwoodsman by James Kirk Paulding, who was a close friend of Bryant's. And it's an amazing story. It really is. Paulding starts off by saying, we're not going to write about these phony heroes. I mean, most of those heroes of European epics, they should be hanged because they don't stand for our principles. I'm going to write about the real hero, the American farmer, the man who subdues the land and takes care of his family. The only problem is, as he starts to write this, it gets very dull. You know? and that's when his interest shifts from the backwoodsman to the people who are being subjugated. And it's not great poetry. It's a fascinating idea. And if I live long enough, maybe we'll write about it. And nobody will read it, but I want to massage this and get to the bottom of it and understand what's going on. I have to read everything that Paulding has written, and I'm only about a third of the way. Yes.
I keep being reminded of the Rhode Island state motto, which is "They think otherwise," which comes from the fact that the nonconformists in Boston sprouted more nonconformists who wouldn't conform with the nonconformists and therefore nonconform in their own part of the world. The point being that there's space to do that in New England, from Boston to Newport, was not that much
Right.
of a trip. They used to say in Newport.
Well, it was a longer trip back then.
Well, yeah, but then they used to say that it was, the Newport was an overcoat warmer in winter than Boston, and that was the way you tell them apart. But my point is, it seems to me that what you have told us about Bryant, of whom I have only known the stuff that circulates in one's head about such things, add up with the fact that what he did, apart from thinking otherwise, was to go somewhere else in order to be able to do it more advantageously or productively or beneficially in some way or other. And the point that I'm really getting at is that it seems to me what is ultimately, I couldn't agree more about people with a certain state of mind and a locale with a certain openness to a state of mind or whatever, getting together, and out of this literature and other things
Yeah.
projecting. But it's what I'm trying to say is that the ability not just to shut up and not just to be a voice in the wilderness, but perhaps to go somewhere and draw a few people around you who will be interested in your particular way of thinking otherwise, is perhaps, it's not just a geographical fact, it's a cultural fact, and it comes with everybody coming from Europe here in the first place. They're used to going from somewhere to somewhere else in order to be able to think.
Are you familiar with the communist societies in 19th century America?
And that's not one of the things that I've explored.
Oh, not Marxist not Marxist, but communitarian groups.
Oh, yeah.
With, our 19th century history is riddled with it.
Yeah, the Shakers and all that.
Pardon?
Shakers and all that.
Yeah, Shakers are part of it,
Yeah.
the Atlanta communities and so
Fair
forth.
enough.
The Mormons.
Yeah.
And one can go on and on and on. There are lots of these people. And there's a fascinating book by a fellow named Charles Nordhoff, who was involved in this movement, and but he's also a good sociologist. And he makes the interesting observation that communities that are organized by women have no sex, and those that are organized by men have free sex. And it's true, you know. And you run down a list of about 25 or 30 of them. Well, you can understand why. I mean, because sex was a way of subduing women, and you know, and not giving them freedom of recognition as human beings, development, education, and so forth. You can also understand why one of the earliest examples of narratives in America that were popular were the captivity tales. And these, always the same pattern. White woman captured by Indians, goes out and doesn't want to come back in many instances. And maybe about a third, doesn't want to come back, prefers life as an Indian to life with a white husband because of the obligation. You know, and what is said over and over again is, I count in an Indian community. I can register my opinion. Everybody tells me to shut up in the congregation. No. Am I dragging this on too long?
I'm not dragging it on, but if we
Yeah.
don't break, it'll be too late
I
for
know.
dessert and food in the
Well,
We'd like you to come back.
it's an exciting story, and I love the story, and I really do, and I love American literature. It's such a rich field, and this interplay between a sense of who we must be. No other nation is so consumed with the idea of what we must be, the identity of the American. The Americans, I mean, people don't worry that much about being Italian or the Italian spirit or the German spirit. Well, German is different. But you know, we are obsessed by this. We are more conscious of our history than Europe is. And this comes out in our literature. And one of the ideas, if I live long enough, I'd love to explore, is that our novelists keep talking about the failure of America to live up to its dream. You know, that's what Faulkner's about. And Faulkner is please read Faulkner. If you're going to limit your reading in American literature to two authors, Melville and Faulkner. And incidentally, in Woodstock, I'll be talking about Moby Dick for three sessions starting June 2nd, just so you're aware of it. I can't understand why our kids don't read novels, don't understand our poets, and you know, we're a fascinating, if crazy, people, and it's all there. Okay, I'll shut up. And I'm not trying to sell books.